Welcome everybody to Kinokuniya Bookstore today. We have a very special presentation, Unfolded, How Architecture Saved My Life. It's written by Alastair Gordon, but it is about the architecture of Bartholomew Voorsanger. Am I saying your name right?
Correct. Yes, you are. Thank you.
Good, okay. And we have today with us Bartholomew Voorsanger, about who this book is about. Unfolded here, it's published by Oro Editions. We have it for $34.95. You can get a signed copy at the end by Mr. Voorsanger, and also we have a special 90th anniversary Kinokuniya tote bag that you can get for free if you buy the book today. In any case, Mr. Gordon, who wrote the book, is currently in absentia, so I'm filling in as the interviewer. So my name is John Fuller. I am with Kinokuniya Bookstore. I am the events coordinator, one of the managers. But today our honor is to have Bartholomew Voorsanger with us. And I have a few questions for Mr. Voorsanger to answer. And can you tell us a little bit about the author, Alastair Gordon, and the format of the book?
Yeah, Alastair Gordon is the architectural critic for New York. He's been written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Miami Herald. He lives in Miami and New York, and he's right now teaching at Harvard a course on critical review, and somebody I've really known for about 30 years. And a very talented writer, and I think he started writing about Buckminster Fuller a number of years ago, and approached me almost 4 years ago now to write a monograph about my work.
Great, yeah. Just a little description. Alastair Gordon is an award-winning critic and author who has written regularly about the built environment for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. His critically acclaimed books include Naked Airport, Weekend Utopia, and Spaced Out. He teaches critical writing at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design and is editorial director of Gordon DeVries Studio, an imprint that publishes books about the human environment. So, Mr. Voorsanger, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your career in architecture as well.
Well, Alastair approached me to write this monograph, and I went to Princeton as an undergraduate, graduated with honors, and then went on to Harvard Graduate School of Design, and then to Montreal to work with an urban planner named Vincent Ponte. That was extremely interesting and illuminating for an architect to be working on the urban scene. And then moved to New York to work 10 years with I.M. Pei. And that was a formative experience. And then after 10 years with I.M., then at the age of, 44 at that point, 43, 45, I get 44, I formed my own firm with a partner, Ed Mills, called Voorsanger Mills. And that was our start back in, 1979, or 89, so 79, and then reorganized the firm in 89, just as Voorsanger Architects.
Right. And how do you feel about the field of architecture today? What situation is it in right now, and where is it going, would you say?
I find this an incredibly interesting time right now, because when I was at Harvard, and this goes back now 3 or 4 decades ago, there was a very unitary point of view about how architecture should be designed. It was sort of a brutalist notion of modernism. And I think then postmodernism emerged, and that opened up new strategies, all kinds of new strategies. And at that point, I think we're now into a time where computers have even further liberated architects, both in terms of time and in terms of options. And I think this is an extremely exciting time. Also coinciding with this is a new invention of materials, new concerns deeply felt about the environment, the impact of architects responding to those issues. And I think this is an incredibly exciting time.
What would you say is the most revolutionary, has the most revolutionary impact on the field right now as far as technology?
It's clearly the computer, and the computer is such, and the programming is such, that the old notion of if you need to hire somebody in your office, the notion that it could span 3 or 4 generations of experience is very difficult. It's very hard, quite frankly, to hire anybody over about 24 years of age, because they simply don't know the programs. And the programs are intensive. Everybody's communicating simultaneously with construction, with the owner, and we're all communicating across the world, and with go-to meetings and these kind of systems now of communication. We have meetings every Wednesday talking to Germany, Mexico, Texas, California, and we just don't need to travel. And everybody can interactively draw, communicate. It's a liberating process.
Has like satellite imaging or GPS had any effect on architectural techniques and design?
It probably does, I think, probably in terms of potentially policing, in terms of zoning, in terms of cities trying to make certain that people are behaving. And with satellite imagery, you can absolutely determine people are not overextending zoning issues. No, I think it's the instantaneous communication that's going on right now. And I think back to when I started architecture, obviously at Pay's office, and then continuing on in my own firm, you had time to really think through issues. And the owner never expected something tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon. You would say, I'll get this to you next week or the week after, because we have to build models, we have to do renderings, we have to discuss this internally, we need to estimate it with the contractor, and that is all done now virtually simultaneously. So we are right now, when we're designing in real time. We put up, right now I'm designing the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is about 350,000 square feet. And it's our national story, the National Museum for the World War II. And we have designed it as a series of pavilions. And 3 are completed, and now they have almost 800,000 visitors a year. It's been an extraordinary success, and we're completing the last 2. But as we're designing those in the office right now, we're designing them in real time, and we can see them three-dimensionally, change them, and at the same time it's simultaneously changing all the plans, sections, drawings, and sending them simultaneously to a contractor if we want estimating, and to an owner to be able to review what we're doing.
So are there any particularly challenging issues to working in a place like New Orleans, and how does that compare to, say, like doing architecture in New York City?
Well, New York is a unique environment. I would suggest for the moment that New York is almost the center of the world at this point. It really was kind of a combination between New York, London, conceivably China, but at this point with Brexit, just the coalescence of everybody coming to New York. And the difference between New York and New Orleans is I can replace my office literally every week with people more talented than what we are, including myself. New York is just phenomenal in terms of the draw of talent, of young talent, of exciting people. And in a place like New Orleans, even though it's now drawing young people, and it's becoming a very much more vital city, that is a big challenge. And if you're in Des Moines, Iowa, and you lose 2 or 3 of your key people, you have a real problem.
In both New Orleans and perhaps New York in the future, do you have any challenges concerning like climate change and the flooding situations, like after a Hurricane Katrina or something like that?
Oh, well, I think for New Orleans, of course, the whole flooding situation was just catastrophic, and it really pulled the city apart. And I think in our project, the National World War II Museum, we were just beginning to start putting that out to bid, and the hurricane arrived, blew everything up. When I went down there about 8 weeks after the hurricane, the board clearly was in a state of shock. And it was really almost akin to like World War II. And they had to pull themselves together. And I must say, they had tremendous courage and to be able to restart the whole project, to continue to raise money and support it. And they've continued on, and it's been now a staggering success. I wish we could take all the credit for it, but it's museology and their effort and the combination of architecture. And it's in the book, in Unfolded.
Now, in the title you say Unfolded, How Architecture Saved My Life. Can you comment a little bit about that? How did it save your life? What did it do?
Well, what Alastair did was he spent the first 2 years going through the projects and visiting projects again and seeing things and writing about them. And at the end of 2 years, he turned to me and said, all right, well, I've got to put something on the back of the book. Where were you born? Where'd you go to school? And all this kind of thing. And then he said, oh my God, he said, I've got to rewrite this thing. So he took another 2 years, and it's become half monograph, half memoir, the book. And he then said, I really got to integrate your life into your architecture, because clearly your life affected how you designed and your architecture. And so if I go back just very simplistically, I have a twin brother, and we were born in Detroit, Michigan. My mother was a Jewish seamstress, and turned out her husband was a bigamist and abandoned her. And then we were put into an orphanage in the North Bronx, the big Jewish orphanage, and stayed there, and it was really pretty devastating experience. And that affects you for a long, long period of time. But from my adoptive parents were from San Francisco, and they got us in New York, and now this is in 1940, 41, and there are no airplanes, so he took us on a train, and they came back and said, we cried for 3,000 miles going back to San Francisco. But then went to school, but we were, at that point, really very badly shaken up, because in an orphanage, they have now discovered, they did some sociological studies, and they realized that if you don't physically nurture a child, the child will emotionally die, which means that they no longer can discern between what's right and wrong, and they become emotionally neutral. And so, for example, when Hitler staffed the SS, he emptied all the orphanages in Germany and Austria, and you get to be in a very dangerous state. We were sort of halfway there. But anyway, being brought up in San Francisco, I went to Lowell High School and then ultimately went to Princeton and graduated with honors from Princeton, and then went on to Harvard. And Harvard was pretty much, quite frankly, a waste of time. I know that sounds probably a little, sanctimonious or something, but Princeton was the really revelatory experience. And I just have to cite one example of that. I remember my first studio there at Princeton, the professor asked us to go out, walk outdoors and look at the campus and come back in 15 minutes. So 15 of us walked around and we came back. And then he said, all right, I want you to draw a building that you saw. And we looked at each other and were completely stunned, because we'd looked at the buildings, but we really didn't see them. So he said, all right, go back out again and come back in 10 minutes. And we went back out, and that changed forever how I looked at architecture. And for the first time, I realized I was looking but not really seeing. And now I can remember a building 30 years later, that I've seen. Anyway, but going on then, and then to Montreal, and then working with IMP was marvelous for that decade. And then we formed our own firm. But there are traumatic parts of my life.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you go through the book, I don't particularly want to talk about them now, but you can see how architecture wound in and out of, the death of my child and things like that.
So if you're going into architecture, Princeton, folks, Princeton, remember that? If you take nothing else away today, that's what you want to know. Why the memoir as an architectural book? Why particularly the memoir as its subject in it?
Well, he felt that the character of my life is, for him and apparently others too, feel it's kind of fascinating, the kind of episodes of things that have gone through, the kind of clients we've had are quite extraordinary, and I think it's been all kinds of everything from museums to airport work to residential, and so that experience he just found fascinating, and so it became a hybrid book, and maybe because of that it will be saleable. Monographs are not particularly saleable right now, but I think this might actually make it more saleable. And I've told Alastair a number of events and things that happened. I'll just give you one kind of little episode. We did a lot of residences for interesting people, and one of them was Richard Simmons, of course, the great and wonderful guy. And we had an office on 57th Street, and Richard walked into our office with his boyfriend at that time, called Shooter, who turned out to be a basketball player at LSU. And when Richard said, when I was a sophomore watching Shooter play, he was 6'5", this gorgeous guy. I lusted after him, but all the women lusted after him too, and I thought I never had a chance. And then later it turned out he was one of us. Okay. So anyway, could you put your hand out for a moment? Put your hand right there. And so when Richard sat down at the conference table, he put his hand on my hand like this, and he said, "Bart, I want you to know something right now. I do not go out with married men." Of course, the whole office broke up, but he was an incredibly interesting client, and it was never a dull moment. But all the way to museums, to airport work, and issues like that. Yeah.
Can you comment, earlier you mentioned materials as being something that's changing in architecture. What are some of the trends in materials? What are the things that you like to work with? What do you think are good for the expression of your architecture, your design, and things like that?
Well, I think, we were pretty much exposed to curtain wall systems, to aluminum, to steel, and all these kind of things. And I think it's not so much a difference in material as how you use them. And I think Frank Gehry, for example, broke a lot of really interesting ground, experimental ground, because he took basically a small sheet of stainless steel, polished aluminum steel, and basically used it as shingles, vertical shingles, on deformed surfaces, and then produced these extraordinary buildings. And I think that liberated architecture in many ways to using conventional materials in completely unconventional ways. And I think that is something that has been really a fascinating evolution.
Great.
And what did you learn from I.M. Pei, would you say?
Oh, that's a good question. I.M. was an incredibly interesting man, because first of all, he could have been a CEO of any Fortune 500 company. He was really brilliant, mathematically brilliant. Geometrically, he had an intuitive sense of geometry. I remember I would argue about some particular geometry, and I would say it doesn't work, and it would take me 2 days to figure out why it didn't work. Also, he infused his projects with his own persona. In other words, you go to an I.M. Pei project, and it's not institutional, it's not generic. You really feel the persona in that project, and he's, in that particular case, he was fascinating. And I think one of the first experiences I had when I was just starting, he came to me and asked me to design a box, a presentation box. They were going to send some material to some client, I think, in Japan. So I didn't quite know what I was doing. And so I quickly knew I didn't have any idea what I was doing, so he took it away from me. And he said, this is what I would like you to do. And he then produced this incredibly elegant, simplistic box out of linen, taut linen with particular wrapped corners. And I just realized you can take this horizontal, rectangular box and with just incredibly beautiful detailing and a very careful idea about materials, and it can be transformed from something totally generic to something incredibly extravagant and elegant and not cost a lot of money. And that was revelatory. It was just this object that was fascinating. And I remember when I was approached by a Japanese client who said, we want to interview for a big project in Osaka, send a portfolio. So I went back to this idea that IM had had. So I went down to Florida and I found this millwork person, and they'd found this wood that had been in a bog for 90 years and had this incredible veining through it, and dried it out over 6 or 8 years. And I made this box with this incredibly beautiful lacquer finish on this particular wood, and then lined it with material I was able to get at an antique store, a Wiener Werkstätter material. And it took me about 2 months to make this box, and he kept saying, where is it? Where's your presentation? I said, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And then I had just 10 sheets of photographs on a particular vellum, antique vellum, and sent that. And I didn't hear anything for a short while, and then he went completely crazy and said it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen, and he kept it honorifically in the right corner of his desk. And he told me that when Kinokuniya, who was a very distinguished architect in Japan, visited him, he saw the box and said, what's that box? What is that box? And he said, oh, it's a box an architect sent me. And he said, well, what's in it? And he said, well, there's some drawings and things. And he said, well, can I see it? He said, no. So I'm trying to, it's not Kurakuda, I'm trying to remember the architect. It was Tadao Ando, I'm sorry, it was Tadao Ando, okay. And I wish I could have been there for that, but anyway. So that's some sense of working, and Pei was, I think the marvelous thing about Pei, which I took into my office, was he designed in front of you. Now that may not mean anything, but typically what architects do is get 2 or 3 people, they work together in a little studio, and then they pass that out to the production, and 10 or 15 people are doing all the drawings, and you have no idea how the principal arrived at that idea. But IM would design in front of us, in front of the team, and so you understood, the evolution of the idea and what was instinctually important to him in terms of the development of it. And very few architects are willing to do that. But I took that into my own practice. I thought that was really critically important. Yeah.
Great.
So getting back to the book is out now. It's been published, I think it came out in April, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And how has that affected you since the book has come out?
Well, I must say it's very interesting. People are reading it, and I get very different reactions. Women and men react completely differently. This is turning out, whether they're architects or non-architects. And women are reacting much more emotionally to the book than men are, I think. I think men are kind of saying, okay, you had problems, so get on with it, kind of thing. And women are kind of burrowing into it, and because there's a lot of emotional issues that are discussed. And so, but I get very emotional letters, and some very extreme and some very modest, but it's been fascinating, really. And Alastair writes, just poetically. He writes so beautifully, and it just transforms a lot of the ideas or comments I'm making. and makes them, I think, formative in a way that I think ad hoc I wouldn't be able to accomplish.
And how is what you discuss in the book, how has that in a concrete way affected your design?
I think it's well, first of all, he's asked me to discuss a lot of projects that are historic projects for me, and I go back and you have to synthesize your point of view and come back down to a few sentences and to a few ideas. And I think it's helped me in an odd way communicating with the client and, you know, other public entities that I'm involved with. For example, one of the comments I made that he's been pretty widely discussed was, you know, architecture is a public event, and I don't think architects really have internalized that issue. In other words, every time you build a building, it is a public event, and it can affect thousands of people or just a few people. And one of the things that's so difficult for the kind of work we're doing is our clients are very private, in some cases residences, and you've done something incredibly special for them, and nobody ever sees it except the contractor, and then when the door closes, maybe there's 15 people a year. And but if it's published, then of course it's now open, and I am finding out from other publishing groups that this work gets disseminated in Instagram, and it's just, you can't believe how widely disseminated the information, and I'm really kind of astounded by it, the instant publication and recognition of material. And I don't think it's just this, I think it's just all information is now available in an extraordinary way.
Great. Well, I think we can open up. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for Mr. Voorsanger?
Other influences besides IMP?
Other influences besides IMP is the question.
That's a good question. I think idiosyncratically, ipso facto, yes, absolutely. And I think seeing somebody's work, seeing, for example, I was just, I'm just thinking this recently, I was just in Scotland, and for the first time I'd never been to Scotland, I've been all around the world, and I saw Macintosh's work for the first time, really in situ. And I realized that as a designer, you really see work completely differently than other people see it. And I looked at that work and I really realized he really wasn't an architect. He was really a designer and a decorator, and a brilliant one, and really quite extraordinary. And so I think that affected me. It was very interesting. I just thought, you know, here's somebody that only cares about the evolution of design up to the height of 7 feet. After that, he's abandoned the room, kind of thing. And then I thought about my work, where I am fascinated by ceilings and roofs, and because some of my clients only want orthogonal rooms, but they never realize the ceiling could be different. And so I've been able to transform these spaces with ceilings, with folded plate and issues, and the book is titled Unfolded, and that really came out of an engineer that I was working with. We're doing a house in Snowmass for Leon Hirsch, who's the former president of U.S. Surgical, and I wanted long spans on the house. The house is 240 feet long, and I wanted long spans on the house. 140 feet long, and Matisse Levy, who was the structural engineer, suggested the do folded plate, and I didn't know what that meant, but I did remember that Felix Candela had actually invented this. He's a Mexican architect, and he came to Harvard when I was at Harvard at school, and I remember he spent 2 or 3 hours explaining the dynamic of folded plate with quadratic equations over 2 blackboards. And of course we all pretended that we understood it. We had no idea what he was doing. And do you have a piece of paper? Can I borrow a piece of paper? And, and what it is, if you can hold this for a moment. This has no structural capacity, okay? And what Candela figured out was, you fold this like this, and all of a sudden, it's structural. Now, if you load this up with snow, for example, let's say this is the roof, it will collapse. However, you put what's called a tension tie underneath this, or that, a tension tie on the bottom of this, and it becomes an incredibly efficient structure. And so, this is more technical now, but from the bottom of this tension tie to this point is called the altitude. And so if it's 15 feet, this will span 150 feet. And this is only 4 inches thick. And so we were able to have spans of 90 feet incredibly efficiently, incredibly inexpensively. And then once I started that, I then realized I could play with it. And then you can start deforming a conventional span, and you start then having a roof that can do that. Or you can then continue to deform it and play with it, where you then have a roof that does that. And then you can start tearing it apart and like this, and then it can then start with a clerestory like that. So we started playing with this, and this gave us incredible liberty and an amazing internal space and deformation. And if you are able to get unfolded, you'll see the house in snowmass. And so that's an influence from our engineers. And I think the future of architecture, going back to one of your earlier questions, is absolutely teamwork, with working with planners, landscape, engineering, with computer scientists. This is the future integration, and the best work we've ever done is really integrating large teams of people, and that becomes transformative and really fascinating. Yes, yeah. You know, the question is, was I influenced by Le Corbusier's Ronchamp, which is the curved undulating roof? No, for a slightly different reason. That's almost a, how do I describe it, a vegetal form, you know. It's not a mathematical form, it's a vegetal form, and it's a very personal form. And so it's a gesture on his part. And it's the same thing with Gary. Gary does a lot of the same kind of things, just sort of gestures, which are art gestures. And so you can't imitate or learn. I mean, you can learn from it and be fascinated by it, but it's not derivative in terms of the learning experience. Whereas you're dealing with a mathematical folded plate system, you can then start playing with it, deforming it, and working with it, and evolving it into different kinds of evolutions. You know. Yes.
A book is not as complicated as a building, but it sounds like you still spent a couple of years on it, so it was a big time investment. What do you hope to accomplish with the book? And also, are there any of your personal aesthetics incorporated in the design of the book?
Good question. I'm just going to paraphrase your question. Is the book is not writing a book is not as complicated as doing architecture. But what is the effect of the book had on me, and did I have my input in the design of this? No, I didn't. But the only input I did have was I asked Chip Kidd, the book designer, and Chip is a good friend, and Chip agreed to design the cover, and so I'm very proud of that, and I'm a great admirer of his work. He's really extraordinary. And then Dell Upton, who is an extraordinary, distinguished historian, architectural historian, wrote the foreword. He teaches at UCLA and is probably one of the most prominent architectural historians in the country right now. And Dell did the foreword. And so I think that was probably the most input I had into it, because working with Alastair, his wife did the graphics, and I would say Alastair, please can you use a different photograph in this project? No. Can you use a plan? No. Can you add a section to the building in the obligation? No. He said, Bart, this book is going to be 200 pages, period. Okay. And you sell books. I gulped hard and I said, I'm not the author, and he's the author, and he made the decisions. But I can tell you, people are telling me they've sat down, started this book, and didn't get up until they finished it. And so it is digestible, I guess, in 3 or 4 hours, or however long it takes to read 200 pages. And I must say, and I think in that sense, it was hard for me because I want to explain in great detail what happens, and Alastair wasn't interested in that. And he was interested in the gestures and the inclinations of architecture. Those are the ideas that he was interested in. And then the linkage between that and my life, and how something affected. And yes, please.
Talk a bit about designing residences for an individual or family, but I'm curious about the museum work, especially the World War II Museum. Lots of stakeholders, lots of people involved. Could you talk a little bit about the process and what sort of, was there like one idea or a sort of core idea that you really wanted to hold on to for design?
Well, design, it's a good question, is how did approaching museums and what were the issues, the core issues that how I would approach a museum and that particular museum. And that museum started as, it was a D-Day museum that Stephen Ambrose started, and then he died, and it was completed in 2001. And I remember reading the book that he wrote about the museum, and it took them 11 years to raise $10 million. And I thought something is strange about New Orleans, because in New York, you can raise $10 million on a weekend with 2 foundations, okay? And so when I was shortlisted for the final competition, there were 5 architectural firms. We then received a 130-page program by Lord Associates out of Canada, and we had to design the entire project in 7 weeks, 8 weeks. And so I read that and I realized this is 300,000 square foot building. This is like a third of the Metropolitan Museum. They can't afford this thing. I said they opened up the D Museum, but I said my wife back there in the rear is a museum director of a couple of distinguished museums, and I know how hard it is to start and to maintain it and to hire and to build a program. And so we were given a diagram showing that they wanted to build it all out as a single building with the parking garage at one end and the original D-Day at the other. A single loaded building, which is a little bit like a mall as a museum, but they wanted to phase it. And you can't phase that. It's very difficult to phase it. And I knew they didn't know what they're talking about. So I designed it as a series of pavilions, 5 pavilions. Now, museum types hate pavilions because what they want you to do is they want to control you, and they want to make certain that you never leave the museum, okay? That you walk from gallery to gallery to gallery. And all of a sudden, now you can go out of a gallery and go get something to eat or go home, and maybe you don't see the other most important things. But everybody gulped hard at the competition, and they realized we were the only scheme that was really buildable and operational, because then the reason for the pavilions was 5-fold or 4-fold. One, you could phase it economically. You could raise the money for it. Operationally, you didn't have to build 300,000 square feet. You built 45,000 square feet. Thirdly, you have a naming opportunity. Okay, they can be named. This is incredibly important. Fifth, that when you have the opening, you can invite the President of the United States, or the Vice President, or the Governor. And I know from my wife sitting back there, Peggy Lohr, that when she had her opening of a museum in Napa, you know, everybody showed up, and then after that, you then have to pay the bond issue, and you're all struggling for the next few years. This way, they've had these sequential openings for the 3 or 4 pavilions now, and every one has got Spielberg and Tom Hanks and governor from California and vice president, and each of these is very spectacular, plus bringing the story, evolving the story, and evolving how you're going to run the museum. And I must say they have really been brilliant running it. And so it's been this amazing success. It now has like 800,000 visitors a year, and we've only 3/5 of it built out at this point. And now we're building the last 2 pavilions, and it's been an amazing success. And but that was how, and I was the only one that did that, and we were selected unanimously in that sense. And also it, and then spiritually in terms of the design. Going back to how I approached the design was when they came to us, they said, first of all, I didn't want to do the museum. I didn't want to be involved in competition because I said I don't want to celebrate war. That's not my interest. But they said, no, that's not what we want. We want to celebrate seeking the peace and liberation, and that's the message we want to send. Okay. So in doing the buildings, I wanted the architecture to be a number of different things. First of all, war is indeterminate. I mean, for example, we had no idea we were going to win for the first 2.5 years. We were in terrible trouble. War is indeterminate. You don't know what's going to happen. So the architecture needed to be indeterminate. I didn't want to start dealing with orthogonal buildings. I didn't want to do determinist design. I wanted to be indeterminate. Okay. And then the second aspect of it is I wanted the architecture to be on the level of visual intimidation. War is a very frightening thing. I didn't want to frighten people, but I wanted it to be almost on the level of intimidation. Okay. And then thirdly, I wanted the architecture to protect our troops. Now, I know that sounds slightly corny, but so I went back to mythology, to the shields, the mythological shields, and I started researching all of those, and we started taking it into metallic shields on the buildings, at a very large scale. And then I realized the metaphor was becoming too literal, and it wouldn't work. So then I moved the shields into precast concrete, into very, very large precast concrete. And so all the concrete's interlocking, and they're 45-foot by 8-foot sections, and it's a massive scale, and it's had a deformed architecture, indeterminate, and so you've got to go down, and it's hard to visually explain it. You have to go down and see it. So, any more questions, please? Yes.
It sounds like you didn't necessarily have a great experience at Harvard. And is that a reflection of the state of architectural education or something else?
The question is, I didn't have a great experience at Harvard, and is that the state of architectural teaching at now or the time? And well, first of all, I was there before a lot of people were born here. Okay, so this is in 1961 to 64. Okay, and at that time, the faculty were sort of mostly emigres from Europe, and I mean, I'm Jewish, so I can say this, but if you hadn't been at a concentration camp, you weren't really entitled to teach architecture, kind of thing. You hadn't suffered enough. So, and the faculty hated each other, and so I remember, I graduated with honors from Princeton and had advanced standing. And I remember my first studio, I did some stupid design of an elementary school. That was the project. And so the chairman of the department went over to my drawings. This was a big event, celebrating, seeing what the new class could do, kind of studio could do. And he went over, and I had made the sky blue or something like that. He went over and he said, sniffed at the drawings and then said, "This is the most disgusting project I have seen in my entire years at Harvard." I thought to myself, wait a moment, what is going on here? I thought I graduated with honors from Princeton. What is happening here? And then Sergei Chamayev, who was very famous, was all still teaching there, who was one of the founders of SIAM in Europe, of modern architecture, conceptual modern architecture. Sergei Chamayev went over, and he's about 6'4", this terrifying Russian. And I thought, well, this is really the end of me, and I might as well pack up, and I'm going to save my father a lot of money. And he walks over, sniffs at the drawings, and says, "I think this project is brilliant." So I said, yes. And then they started fighting like cats and dogs. And then it took me about 2 weeks to realize that if the chairman had liked it, Chamayev would have come over and said, "I hate it." Because all they wanted to do was fight with each other. And so they just fought, cats and dogs, all the time. And it was just dispiriting, and there was a unitary idea about how you're going to design. It was sort of semi-brutalist modern architecture. And Jose Luis Sert was the chair of the department. He was an urbanist. And it was a waste of time. And I got more out of European literature at Princeton and studying Renaissance Baroque sculpture with Holderbaum at Princeton than any of that kind of stuff at Harvard. You know. But going forward, I think it had some very bad years. And then the new dean there now, who's been there 6 years, is Mohsen Mostafi, who's Persian, who's doing a fabulous job. And the president, this is very important, the president of Harvard really supports him and likes him, and that hasn't always been true. And so I was able to give a gift to Harvard to celebrate Mohsen. And so I've come full circle. So, anyway. Any more questions? Yes, please.
If I were to take a pilgrimage to 3 places around the world to see an amazing building or skyline, where would you send me?
Oh, good question. If I were to go to see 3 buildings in the world, where would you recommend I go? You're excluding my work, of course.
Yeah, well, that's
Okay.
an obvious.
Okay, all right.
First we'll go there. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would say go to Bilbao and see Frank Gehry's. That was, I think, his breakthrough project. And when you do come into the valley, the downtown, and the river, it's a river gorge coming into his project, it is absolutely revelatory. It's really fabulous. Then I think another project I've always loved is the Salk Institute in San Diego by Lou Kahn, which I think is absolutely marvelous. And it's the kind of project I like. I always define great architecture as really, you'll appreciate this, opening a book, and it permits you to keep turning the pages. In other words, it's not complete. In other words, I remember when the first time I saw the Salk Institute, I was on my way down from LA, and I went to see, oh gosh, who was the Princeton postmodern, what's his name? Anyway, he did, there was a, San Luis Obispo, there was a, oh gosh.
Oh, yeah, he designed stuff for Target as well.
Yeah.
Michael Graves.
Michael Graves, yeah. Michael Graves had done a building down on the coast. I've forgotten the name of it. And I went down and I walked through, I wanted to see it, and I know Michael is an old friend. And when I left, I remember I left and I was driving further down to go down to see Salk, and I realized I never need to go back to this building. You know, it's complete. And I realized at that point that's kind of an inherent weakness. And then you go to Salk, you can go back over and over and over again, and the quality of the light. If it's raining, it's doing one other kind of thing. Moving through the buildings, the texture of the concrete, it's so poetic. And then a third building. Oh gosh, I'd go now probably to a more historic example. And I think maybe rather than a contemporary building, go to, let's see, there's so many great historic buildings, but let me try to, give me a moment because I'm trying to, and I'm going through France and Italy, but I'm trying to, what's the, give me a moment. I'm trying to pull up a building, and I'm halting for a moment, but I'll pull it up for you.
While he's thinking, you can think of another question. Anybody?
How much, you know, as a private citizen, how much am I able to see of the Salk Institute? Because, you know, Louis Kahn's, I mean, you know, I admire his work, and it's the light and the interiors as well as the exteriors. I mean, am I able to get inside?
Yes, pretty much so, yeah.
Okay.
And I would say the exterior envelope and all that is, for me, almost 70% of its magic. And the interior is not that terribly interesting. It's about 30%. However, if you go to his museum in Texas there, the interior is really magical. It's completely different. You know. And that's completely transformative. That's a completely different issue. I think Renzo Piano's museum in Fort Worth, you know, is also very spectacular, very serene, very elegant building, and Dumanil and is very elegant and wonderful. I mean, I'm just thinking now of sort of three modern contemporary buildings. Any other questions? Yes.
I could probably just go on with questions, but when you, the Louis Kahn, the Salk Institute, I'm thinking about the water as well, and how important is water in your work, or is it? Maybe it's not.
The question is, having seen Salk and the water, and how important is water in my work, really very rarely have I used water, and I think I always feel really water is more of a landscape issue, and in that case he really was designing a landscape. That building is really like 2/3 landscape, 1/3 architecture. So he is the landscape architect in that sense. And
One last question. Which building of yours do we start with?
starting with which building of mine, the unfortunate thing is you can't get into tons of them, but for example, I would love you to see the house in Aspen and Snowmass, and that's now owned by Roman Abramovich. Bought that from my client, and Roman and Dasha live there right now, and another would be the World War II Museum. I think is really completely remarkable. There's also a house in Napa that we could arrange to get you into. They are very private clients, but that was just very recently done, and a kind of an amazing tour de force of exquisite construction and materials put together. It was really amazing. You know.
Can you see any of these online? Are there any pictures listed?
Well, you see it in the book. I'm trying to think whether I might have it on our website. You go Voorsanger.com. They're very private, and we finally were allowed to publish it by some obscure Italian publication, and then after it got published, I'm sort of naive about this. I didn't realize it, but the moment it's published, it was then picked up by Instagram, by everybody. It's just now everywhere, all around the world. So, but it's the Napa residence, and you can pull that up. You know. So.
Is your own home?
What's my own home? Well, we've just sold my apartment here in New York because we're moving to Napa. Actually, Peggy has a house in Napa. And I'm now renovating that and re-landscaping that. And you have about 7 weeks to see that before the new owner takes over. No, I never wanted to publish it, and it was just a private thing. But I completely gutted a 2-bedroom apartment and made it into a large 1-bedroom. And No, it's never been published. I never published it. And I can't really afford to build a lot of my work. I need clients to build it. Okay. And
Any other questions? Last question. Think of a good last question from someone. Somebody who hasn't asked a question. No?
okay. Anyway, thank you very much.